Alright, now we're going to talk about a real-life use case. By the way, I do want to mention that this is quite an advanced use case, so you shouldn't be scared of all the coding that is done here. Most of the time, you don't have to do such advanced code if your use case is not as um, complicated. Plus, you don't need to use scripting, as there will be an option where you can use a visual mode, which is very low code, specifically made for simpler use cases, and it'll make it a lot easier and more intuitive for you if you don't have scripting or coding experience. The use case itself, it's a migration from Jira to Azure DevOps. So this company, they decided it's not possible to do the switch from Jira to Azure overnight. So the solution for them was that part of the work was going to happen in Jira and part of the work is going to happen in Azure DevOps. Basically, this company is structured in a very particular way. They have 6,000 developers, which are divided in big teams called grids, and these grids are divided in smaller teams called blocks. And they're also using in Jira a Jira portfolio add-on that allows them to have issue types that are further up from the epic. So instead of epic being the top issue type, they have episodes on top of epics and they have sagas on top of episodes. And there are some very specific requirements for this use case, but for this introduction or introductory demo, it's not necessary. If you want, you can pause the video and take a closer look at the requirements, but the main idea is described in this diagram, which is that sagas, which are the most important issue type or the biggest one, the top one, are going to be maintained only in Jira, whereas the second most important issue type, which is the episode, is going to be synchronized over from Jira to Azure DevOps in read-only mode, and then in the Azure, the epics that are created in Azure, they will be synced back to Jira. But this doesn't mean that user stories are going to sync to Jira, because actually you'll see in the configuration that I'm going to show you that user stories are not going to be synced from Azure to Jira. They'll be maintained in the Azure DevOps side. And on the left side, you can see this Jira project that is standing here by itself. It just means that even if there is synchronization from Azure epics to Jira, there can also be independent Jira projects with their own epics and user stories that are not going to be synced to Azure DevOps. Now, the next step is to actually show you the code about this synchronization. And so I have this snippet open over here. Basically, like I showed you in the first part of the demo, there are triggers which decide when information needs to be synchronized, and the trigger on the Azure DevOps side will be when the work item type is epic and it's under a specific area path. This is because, as you saw in the diagram, we're only syncing Azure DevOps epics back to Jira, and they need to be in a specific area path because that will mean that they're assigned to a certain team which has already migrated. So those are the ones that are going to sync. That's why we have this trigger on the Azure side. Whereas on the Jira side, the trigger is more simple. It's just type equals episode, because as you can see from the diagram, all Jira episodes are going to be synchronized over to Azure. Now, to get into the specifics, basically, like I showed you in the first part of the demo, each side is going to have an outgoing and an incoming script. And on the Jira outgoing script, we are deciding what information from the Jira issues, in this case the Jira episodes, are going to be sent. So these are all the fields that we're going to be sending. You can see we're sending some, besides the default fields, we're also sending some custom fields called target start, target end, and CRA ID number. And then we have the incoming sync, and there's a few important rules here. First one, you can see if replica.type name is episode, return. What this means is, like I told you before, the episodes are going to be in read-only mode on Azure, which means the Jira side doesn't want to receive synchronization back from Azure if the type is an episode. That's why the arrow is going just from Jira to Azure. So this line, it means we're not receiving sync back from Azure when the type is an episode. Then we're also not receiving any sync if the area path is null, because we want to only receive sync back from epics that are under a specific area path. And not only that, but we want to synchronize into different Jira projects depending on what area path the Azure epic has. So if the Azure epic has this area path, then the project will be PB2 in Jira. And if the Azure epic has this second area type, then area path, then the Jira project will be block 1. That's what we're setting up until this part. Then the issue type will be the same as the Jira side. So epic. Then we're setting the epic name in this line. And here we're setting all the normal fields and custom fields like CRA ID number, target start, target end. And we're saying if the other side, so if the Azure epic has the due date set, then we're going to also set issue.due on the Jira side. Then we also have a status mapping. So if the Azure issue is type new, status new, then it should be to do in Jira. If it's refinement, it should be in refinement in Jira. And we're setting that status over here. We're also setting the assignee and the parent link. This part is just it just has to do with the Jira portfolio add-on that I was telling you about. So basically to set a parent saga or a parent episode in the Jira issue. And now Azure DevOps side. The outgoing sync, it says if the issue type is an episode, then only send the replica.key, because as we said, we don't want to sync any information from Azure to Jira when the issue type is episode. Then if not, we're sending all of these other fields. So if it's an epic, we're going to be sending all of these normal fields and also some custom fields like this one. And we're also sending a lot of date fields like the start date, target date, and due date. We're using date format, string, and date format to actually send these date fields in the correct date format so it can be applied in Jira. And then on the incoming sync, so when we receive synchronization from Jira, we're saying only sync the issue type if the incoming ticket is an episode or a bucket. If not, then don't set that issue type. Set a default. Then we're going to define if we're receiving an episode, then we're just syncing these fields, the common ones, and this custom field here. Then we define our status mapping again if it's of type episode, and we set it here. Then if it's not an episode, so for any kind of issue, we're always going to sync the attachments and comments. And then in this last few lines, we're going to be setting the start date, target date, and due date fields if there's if they come from the Jira side as well, those custom fields. Thank you.